right, folks, we are back here on WLTH 1370 AM. That's 92.7 in the FM dial. I hope you guys enjoyed the Peter Brown. I had no idea the dude was white. All these years, I've been listening to that song. Had no idea man was white. That's the thing I love about working here at WLTH. I've discovered so much music from so many different types of people, like old school music and stuff that, you know, and that I really didn't know much about these people. And man, there was a lot of talent during that era. Really was. White people, black people, Hispanics, like just talent coming out of everywhere during that era. But we are back here on Straight Out of the Cannon with me, Scott Cannon. It is 7:32 in the PM, and I think it's time. I think it's time for our reoccurring segment, History's Greatest Monsters. Let's do it, folks. Yes, it is time for History's Greatest Monsters. So let's do this. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed your 4th of July weekend. I know I certainly did. I stuffed my face, as I am prone to do, and hung out with my family, which is always cool. We also celebrated my mom's birthday on July 6th. So happy birthday, Mom. You know I love you. And if you listen to the show, you know how much I value my mom, how much I love my mother and all of wisdom. But, and this is a big but, every year that we celebrate my mom's birthday, I'm also reminded that she shares a birthday with a man who, unlike my mom, isn't known for community outreach and activism. Oh no. This man is known for mostly for being responsible for being maybe the biggest war criminal of the 21st century thus far. It's still a young century, so we got a lot of ways to go, but in terms of war criminals, this man's the worst of the worst. Let's go deeper into the vortex of suck. George Walker Bush was born on July 6th, 1946, in Grace New Haven Hospital in New Haven, Connecticut. He was the first child of George Herbert Walker Bush and Barbara Pierce, and was raised in Midland and Houston, Texas, along with his 4 younger siblings, Jeb, Neil, and Marvin, and Dorothy. His paternal grandfather was a man named Prescott Bush, who was a U.S. Senator from the state of Connecticut. But he's probably best known these days for being a collaborator with the Nazis in World War II. Prescott was the founder and one of 7 directors of the Union Banking Corporation, an investment bank that operated as a clearinghouse for many of the assets and enterprises held by German magnate Fritz Thyssen, who was an early supporter of Adolf Hitler and the main financier of the Nazi Party. Prescott Bush was also involved in the 1934 business plot, which was a failed plan by a lot of America's wealthy to trick retired Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler into helping them overthrow President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, what's sort of funny about the times that we live in currently is that I heard Juan talking about Zoran Mamdani in his show on Nuestra Comunidad before my show, and it just sort of reminded me how far to the right this country has gone. Because there's really nothing that Zoran Mamdani has really proposed that wouldn't have been at home in Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. policies. And a lot of the class warfare that people talk about is really just basically Franklin Roosevelt policies. About not like wanting billionaires to rule over us and lord over us. That's Franklin Roosevelt right there. You know the only guy to get elected 4 times in American history? That guy. And so Prescott Bush, who was a wealthy director of the Union Banking Corporation, a lot of his bankster friends wanted to overthrow, literally stage a coup of the American government and throw Roosevelt out of office under the grounds that he was actually holding rich people accountable for the things they had done to crash the economy during the Great Depression. So with roots like that, you know George W. Bush is going to be something special. George was an average student, but somehow he ended up being able to go to Yale anyway. Because like many times in his life, he failed upwards. And he became a member of the Skull and Bones fraternity, the secret society that they have at Yale of a lot of the richest, wealthiest people in the country and powerful people in the country. His father was a member of the Skull and Bones, George H.W. Bush, who went on to become the CIA director and also vice president and president. He was a member of the Skull and Bones. So was William Howard Taft, who was one of the founders' sons. Also, his, fun fact, in 2004, George W. Bush's opponent, John Kerry, was also a member of Skull and Bones. So not only were George W. Bush, and John Kerry both members of this secret fraternity of the wealthiest, some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the country, they were also cousins. A lot of people don't know that. They were cousins. And so if you want to look at the event that probably radicalized me politically more than anything, it is getting out to vote at 5:30 in the morning, standing outside of my polling place to vote for John Kerry in 2004, only to find out after he lost that not only were him and George Bush cousins, that they were members of this secret fraternity. So of course I felt like a chump. But I'm absolutely glad that I did find that out, because that's how I found out that really the Democrats and Republicans are just pretending. Politics is pro wrestling. At least the Democrats, the way the Democrats and Republicans do it. These people don't really hate each other. They're friends. They hang out. They're frat brothers and sorority sisters. They serve the same interests. They're funded by the same people. And so I thank God for the 2004 election where I could figure that out. After Yale, George W. Bush was commissioned into the Texas Air National Guard. After 2 years of training in active duty service, he was assigned to Houston, flying Convair F-102s with the 147th Reconnaissance Wing out of Ellington Field Joint Reserve Base. Now, obviously, this is the Vietnam era. And so you might think that George Bush, being that we were in the middle of, at that point, America's longest running war, would have been one of the people sent over to Vietnam. But no. Like he did many times in his life, he failed upwards. He barely showed up, and his father's connections got him preferential treatment. He was selected as a pilot in spite of the fact that he had low pilot aptitude scores and barely showed up. This is what we talk about when we talk about affirmative action and DEI. We're talking about George W. Bush. He is the epitome of the most virulent form of affirmative action in America, which is being rich and white and from a powerful family. And so once again, Georgie boy fails upwards. After this, he enters Harvard Business School and graduates in 1975 with an MBA degree. Fun fact, he's the only president in American history to have an MBA degree. But that's not all he was doing. He spent much of his early life in his 20s and 30s as a lush. He was a drunk, admittedly. And in 1976, he was pulled over near his family's summer home in Kennebunkport, Maine, for driving under the influence of alcohol and was arrested for DUI. But in spite of his mediocrity in his school life, in the military, and in just life in general, he once again fails upwards into the business world. In 1977, he established Arbusto Energy, which was a small oil exploration company which began its operations in 1978. The business did not do well, of course. So he changed the name to Bush Exploration to try to exploit his famous family name. But still, the company folded and was absorbed into Harken Energy, with Bush failing upward again, becoming a member of Harken's board of directors. Now, there were many questions about there possibly being insider trading involving Harkins, but the SEC essentially concluded that Bush at the time of his stock sale did nothing wrong. Of course, I'm sure his father being in Congress and the head of the CIA had nothing to do with either one of those things. It was as a board member of Harken Energy that he arranged a group of investors to purchase a controlling interest of the Major League Baseball team, the Texas Rangers, for $89 million and invested $500,000 of his own money to start. He then was the managing general partner for 5 years. Most famously, he is known for trading Sammy Sosa, you know, that guy with 600 home runs, to the Cubs and getting virtually nothing in return. Again, failing. But don't worry, he's going to fail upward. He declares his candidacy for the 1994 Texas gubernatorial election, at the same time that his younger brother Jeb was seeking the governorship in the state of Florida. In the gubernatorial election, his campaign focused on 4 things: welfare reform, tort reform, crime reduction, and educational improvement. His campaign advisors were people whose names would become household names during the Bush administration: Karen Hughes, Joe Albaugh, and, of course, the dastardly Karl Rove, who probably could have his own History Greatest Monster segment, keep it 100. I might end up with doing a History's Greatest Monster segment on Karl Rove in the future. Now, he had a problem when he was running for governor of Texas. The person he was running against was very popular. Her name was Ann Richards. I know if you're old enough, you probably remember Ann Richards, who was the governor of Texas. Very, very popular woman. But of course, Karl Rove and the Bush administration, they went to work and they started a rumor that she was a lesbian. Yes, they said that that's why you shouldn't, people shouldn't vote for her because she's a lesbian. And when a regional chairman of the Bush campaign allowed himself, perhaps inadvertently, to get criticized, to be quoted, he actually criticized Richards for appointing avowed homosexuals, activists, to state jobs. So they couldn't beat Ann Richards straight up, so they just said she's a lesbian who's appointing all these homosexuals to state jobs. And you would think that wouldn't work, but I guess the 90s still was a time when you could just sort of accuse somebody of being, gay, and that would hurt their career, because it worked. He won. He actually beats this very popular governor, Ann Richards, and becomes the governor of Texas in 1995, and immediately he takes aim at Texas' budget. He pushes through the largest tax cut in Texas history of $2 billion. During his tenure, Texas ranked near the bottom in environmental evaluations. His administration lowered the age in which juveniles could be sent to adult courts for serious crimes. He lowered it down to 14. He presided over 152 executions. That is more than any previous governor in American history. 152 executions in 4 years. He failed to give serious considerations to clemency requests, even when there was evidence that could have been exculpatory. But don't worry, folks. He declared June 10th, 2000, Jesus Day. Because as we all know, Jesus has no holidays on the calendar. And within a year, he decided to seek the 2000 Republican presidential nomination. While he was running for president, he portrayed himself as a compassionate conservative. Remember, he portrayed himself as a compassionate. He was so compassionate, implying that he was more centrist than other Republicans, and campaigned on a platform that included bringing integrity and honor back to the White House. Now, remember, in the 90s, the Republicans acted like Bill Clinton was the worst human in the history of the world because he had sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. And so the Republicans ran that they were going to bring integrity back to the White House. We all know how that worked out. By early 2000, the Republican primary centered on Bush and Arizona Senator John McCain. And it was here that Bush's history came back to bite him, because he refused to answer whether ever he had used cocaine. So we know that George Bush was a party boy in the 70s and 80s, and it sort of came back to him in this campaign. But don't count George W. Bush out. Never underestimate his ability to fail upward, and never, ever underestimate the ability of Karl Rove to get in the mud. Because in South Carolina, in the primary, the Bush administration at that point started handing out flyers and made telephone calls to prospective Republican voters suggesting that John McCain was a Manchurian candidate, and that he had fathered a child out of wedlock with a black New York-based prostitute. I love that. Their argument is that he had a child with a prostitute. Okay. When in actuality, John McCain and his wife had adopted a young girl from Bangladesh named Bridget McCain. So they actually took a very valiant and honorable act and turned it into something sleazy. Bush also drew fire for making speeches at Bob Jones University, a school that still banned interracial dating. But none of this hurt Bush. He ended up as the Republican Party's nominee. He moves on to a highly contentious general election against the world's least interesting man in Al Gore. And of course, we all know what happened. Al Gore would win the popular vote, but George Bush would end up winning the Electoral College with help from his own brother, Jeb Bush, who just so happened to be the governor of Florida, who just so happened to stop the votes from being counted in heavily Democratic areas of Florida, that just so happened to hand the election off to his older brother, who just so happened to need Florida to achieve victory in the Electoral College. Now, if this happened in Russia or any other country, America would be willing to overthrow it. And you know that. So now he's president, and immediately he institutes tax cuts that favor high earners, which were criticized for increasing the national debt, almost doubled the national debt from $5.8 trillion to $10.6 trillion without sufficiently stimulating the economy. They also took aim at the environment, withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol, downplaying climate change, and prioritizing energy interest, oil and gas, over conservation. They passed the No Child Left Behind Act, which aimed to which said that it aimed to improve education, but was criticized for its emphasis on standardized testing, underfunding, and punishing underperforming schools, gutting the funding for plenty of schools, particularly in urban areas all over the country. But let's just be honest here. There is no assessing George W. Bush's presidency without talking about 9/11. After ignoring warnings from Vladimir Putin and countless others, including a memo that literally warned that Osama bin Laden was determined to strike inside America, the Bush administration stood by and watched two planes fly into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. In the initial days post 9/11, the country rallied around the president and were eager to believe that he would rise to the occasion. Instead, he used the worst terrorist attack in American history as an opportunity to further the agenda of the neocons in our government, like Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Condoleezza Rice, and Donald Rumsfeld. First, they used the tragedy to grab more executive power and push the AUMF, or the authorization of use of military force, through Congress, which would give the president unilateral power to take us to war, completely subverting the historical precedent stating that only Congress could take us to war. Only the courageous Barbara Lee of California had the guts to vote against it in the House. He used his newly acquired powers to start the Afghan war, which completely destroyed a country that we had used to prop up a country. Our government used to ensnare the Soviet Union in a proxy war that hastened its demise. He also used the attacks of 9/11 to attack civil liberties with the Patriot Act passed in October 2001, which was intended to enhance national security, but faced intense criticism for its impact on civil liberties. We're talking about warrantless surveillance. We're talking about indefinite detention. We're talking about roving wiretaps and a vague definition of terrorism and a lack of oversight and transparency. We're talking about free speech being curtailed, and particularly amongst minorities, specifically Muslims. In the midst of this Orwellian attack on civil liberties, especially against Muslims, they used the rage fomented at Middle Easterners over 9/11 to launch the Iraq War, killing millions of innocent people. Children are still being born with birth defects in Iraq to this day. from the toxic materials and the bombs that our government dropped on innocent people for no reason other than to make money for Dick Cheney's friends at Halliburton and the oil companies that made record profits. We saw scandals like Abu Ghraib that exposed how American soldiers were taught to subject prisoners to ungodly amounts of torture, even if they had not been convicted of anything. The wars that George W. Bush launched set in motion the largest expansion of the military-industrial complex that we've ever seen, which continued through the current day. But no, he wasn't satisfied with just destroying the Middle East. He had to hollow out America as well, filling important positions with his corrupt buddies like Mike Brown, whose experience was in running the International Arabian Horse Administration to run FEMA. Of course, that couldn't go wrong, but it did. And on August 29, 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit, devastating the Gulf Coast with historic levels of destruction due to the haphazard levees built by the Army Corps of Engineers, that left the city of New Orleans and surrounding areas obliterated. What did the Bush administration do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. For days, the people of New Orleans drowned, died of thirst and exhaustion and violence while the world watched on international TV. Even Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez and Cuban President Fidel Castro offered to help the mostly black New Orleans citizens based on the obvious neglect from their own government. The second Bush administration also saw the biggest economic crash since the Great Depression, caused by deregulation started by Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton, but accelerated under George W. Bush. And most of all, George W. Bush's presidency was so bad, it was so bad, that white people ended up voting for a black guy. But that's a story for another episode of History's Greatest Monsters. All right, folks.